Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is Nephilim VA bringing you the 13th chapter of You Either Die a Villain or See Yourself Become a Hero, written by FantasyFreak_2 on AO3. Villain AUs are my beloved, so we must heed the trigger warnings before we proceed. This fanfiction is for mature audiences with canon-typical violence and a trigger warning for abuse, suicide, murder, bullying, and discrimination. If that isn't your style, then I recommend Shades of Green, which is written by Maybe It's Friendly on AO3. It can be found on my channel! Canon Divergence is the name of the game, with this tale of Class 1A being a class specifically for rehabilitating villains in the making. With that being said, the chapter summary is as followed. Class 1A goes on a field trip to the USJ and get attacked by mysterious villains. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 13. USJ. Izuku felt terrible the next day. He had a pounding headache and honestly couldn't tell if it was because of a hangover or sleep deprivation. More likely it was a mixture of both. Aizawa, ironically, looked no more tired than usual, even though he had stayed up just as long as his class. He was probably used to staying up till late hours and sleeping when he could, since he was a teacher at day as well as a hero at night. Izuku's mood improved a lot once they got their costumes, which were enhanced by the support department, and Aizawa let them loose on Training Ground Alpha to test them out. They had half an hour before they had to pack up to get to the bus that would take them to the USJ for their rescue training. After the second building next to Izuku exploded, he started to wonder if Aizawa would regret just letting them loose like that, considering the damage they were already doing, but his teacher just seemed bored. The training ground was probably destroyed several times a day, Izuku figured, so UA should have an easy job repairing it. Izuku used the first minutes with his costume to shoot every kind of gun he had chosen to get a feeling for them, but he knew he wouldn't be able to improve his aim in just 30 minutes, so he began testing the rest of his gadgets. The most fun he had was with the grappling hook, which he used to climb buildings and swing from place to place. He wasn't very skilled, but after seeing him using it, Sero came over to explain his own tactics using his tapes. 30 minutes were over, and before he knew it, Izuku sat in a bus with his classmates, excitedly talking about their new costumes and their functions. Support made me an aiming system for my lightning, Denki explained happily. I didn't even ask for it, but now I won't just electrocute everyone around me. So you would have been fine doing that before support helped you? Shinso asked. Remind me to never be in a group task with you. Oh, don't worry, Denki smiled. You're too pretty to electrocute. So you would have just done nothing and stood around while I did all the work instead? Shinso asked. Denki didn't seem to know an answer to that. I think you broke him, Kirishima said. But I'm happy he got what he needed. I don't need many gadgets with my quirk, I just concentrate on looking cool. You still should think about getting a weapon with some range, Izuku said. It's always good to have various ways of attacking. I'll think about it. I mean, not everyone can make their own grenades with their sweat. Kirishima answered, looking pointedly at Kachan. Kachan rolled his eyes. At least my weapon isn't a fashion accessory. He lazily pointed at Shinso's scarf with his thumb. Shinso grinned. You didn't think that as Mr. Aizawa used his scarf to capture you with it? Kachan crossed his arms in front of his body and looked pointedly away. "Aw, he's pouting," Denki said in a sweet voice. Izuku couldn't help but smile as he saw Kachan trying to throttle his classmate. He really enjoyed that his new friends had no problem putting Kachan in his place with some teasing if he needed it. After arriving at the USJ, the entire class ran out of the bus at once except for Ida, who tried to keep some kind of order. After realizing there was no point, he sighed and just followed them into the giant building. The USJ was incredible to look at. Not only was it big, but also filled with varied environments where you could train for different rescue scenarios. Izuku was looking around so much he nearly ran into 13, who stood in front of the stairs leading down to the training ground waiting for them. Aizawa looked at him, annoyed, and Izuku could hear how he'd asked him quietly where All Might was. 13 just held up 3 fingers, and Aizawa sighed. Izuku had no time to wonder about that, since 13 started talking about the importance of rescue work for heroes. Izuku only listened with half an ear, too busy analysing his surroundings. There was so much to take in that he had problems concentrating on one thing. "Thank you for listening," 13 said finally. The class cheered and Izuku clapped happily along until he saw Aizawa's face turn dark. His teacher turned around as Izuku started hearing a weird sound coming down from the plaza in the middle of the USJ. There was black smoke appearing out of nothing. People were coming out of it. Izuku didn't like being discriminative about appearance of others, since many people nowadays were pushed away by society just by looking villainous. But he had to admit they looked like villains. Aizawa said next to him, apparently either not having the same qualms as Izuku or recognizing some of the men and women exiting the smoke. "Kaminari, can you send a signal to get help?" Denki shook his head. "The signal's jammed." Aizawa didn't look surprised. "I figured something like that would be the case since they came in without triggering an alarm. 13, bring the students out. I'll keep them busy." Izuku stared down at the mass of people coming from the portal, and a black figure with a long beak that loomed over the villains caught his eye. It was several heads bigger than even All Might was, and far more bulky as well. Izuku swallowed nervously and stepped forwards. "But, Mr. Aizawa, you can't erase the quirks of everyone at once." "Problem child, you should especially know that no hero should solely rely on their quirks," Aizawa answered before he began sprinting down the stairs. 13 turned around to usher them out the door, but before he could even get a step forward, black smoke appeared behind him and a hand gripped his suit. "Sensei!" Uraraka shouted and rushed forward, but she could only stare in horror as the suit of their teacher started disintegrating in front of her. The smoke got bigger, revealing a tall, very thin man with severed hands clinging to him all over his body. One of the hands was spread over his face, hiding most of his features, but Izuku could see his gleaming red eyes and wide grin while he looked at 13. Izuku wished he could have later said that he was going through strategies in his head to save his teacher and defeat the villain, but to be entirely honest, the first time he looked a real villain in the face, he froze. It was only for a few seconds, but those would have been enough to watch his teacher turn into dust in front of his eyes. But he didn't. Suddenly the disintegration just stopped, and the villain seemed just as surprised by it as Izuku, by the way he looked at his hand still holding 13 in confusion. Then a white ribbon wrapped around his outstretched arm and dragged him away from 13, who fell to the ground unconscious. Aizawa apparently had managed to turn around from running down the stairs just in time to save his colleague. But that meant that not only did he stand alone against the disintegration villain, and whatever that smoke was that teleported him, but also that there were still dozens of villains behind him coming up the stairs, Izuku realized. The odds were stacked highly against him, but if he was nervous, Aizawa didn't let it show. "Ida, run to the door as fast as you can and get help." But Ida seemed torn between doing what his teacher said and staying to help his classmates. The smoke that had let the villains in the USJ slowly drew into itself, showing a humanoid figure with a face that looked directly at Ida. He seemed to address the villain that had been caught in Aizawa's capture weapon. "Shigaraki, do you need assistance, or should I take care of this problem first?" Shigaraki stared angrily at Aizawa, who was pulling him towards him without breaking his gaze.
"Make sure no one leaves, Kurogiri. I can take care of this."
He then raised his voice.
"Nomu, come to me!"
The smoke man, Kurogiri, vanished to appear between Class 1A and the door. At the same time, Izuku could hear footsteps loud enough to let the ground shake, running towards them up the stairs. They were extremely fast and were coming directly at Aizawa, who couldn't turn around without taking his eyes off Shigaraki. Aizawa seemed to realize that too, and used his scarf to throw Shigaraki to the ground in front of him with a sharp tuck. As Shigaraki lost his balance, Aizawa jumped over him, freeing his capture weapon, and turned around to face whatever was coming towards him. Would he have faced any other enemy, he would have managed it. He didn't. A giant black fist hit him in the side while jumping and threw him backwards, but their teacher managed to roll as he connected with the ground and come up in a crouch. The giant black figure that Izuku had seen down in the plaza had run up the stairs with a speed that All Might would have trouble keeping up with, and now stood in front of Shigaraki. Izuku guessed that it was the Nomu Shigaraki had called. Aizawa's eyes started glowing red and his hair floated around him, and he ran up to the Nomu to kick it in its side, but the creature didn't even seem to notice it. Its long arm whipped around in an inhuman speed, and Aizawa only managed to evade it by centimeters, his eyes still unblinking, directed at the Nomu, even though his quirk erasure didn't even seem to slow it down. Unfortunately, that meant he didn't see Shigaraki wrap his hands around his ankle before Aizawa's trousers started disintegrating, closely followed by the skin of his ankle. Instinctively, Aizawa directed his glowing gaze at Shigaraki, which was more than enough time for the next hit of the Nomu to connect. The crack was sickening, and Izuku stared at the limp form of his teacher on the ground with a head wound that immediately started bleeding heavily. The entire fight had only lasted a few seconds. As Aizawa began moving again, the Nomu simply picked him up by the throat and held him in front of it so that his feet were dangling above the ground. Aizawa tried to loosen his grip, but all he could do was take pressure off his throat by holding himself up with his arms.
"Finally!"
Shigaraki slowly stood up and walked around the Nomu to give Aizawa a look of appreciation.
"You're really cool, Eraserhead, but you're in over your head."
He then turned to 1A. Izuku became aware of the fact that they were surrounded by the Nomu and Shigaraki on one side and Kurogiri on the other. He slowly took a step backwards to stick closer to his classmates. The other ones seemed to follow his lead, forming a small circle with the heavy hitters like Kachan and Todoroki facing outwards. Shigaraki didn't seem to notice, or he didn't care. He positioned himself in front of the class in a way that everyone could easily see him, and straightened up to his full height.
"Members of the villain class, I am your way to salvation."
Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. Welcome to a new month. I hope that May brings you happiness. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, FantasyFreak_2 on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of my next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!